After the Battle of Mukden, the belligerents found themselves in a position which must either prelude another stupendous effort on both sides or be utilized for the purpose of peace negotiations. At this point, the President of the United States of America intervened in the interests of humanity, and on the 9th of June, 1905, instructed the United States representatives in Tokyo to urge that the Japanese government should open direct negotiations with Russia. An exactly corresponding note being simultaneously sent to the Russian government through the United States representative in St. Petersburg. Japan's reply was made on the 10th of June. It intimated frank acquiescence, and Russia lost no time in taking a similar step. Nevertheless, 2 months elapsed before the plenipotentiaries of the belligerents met. On the 10th of August, at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, USA, Russia sent M. afterwards Count DeWitt and Baron Rosen. Japan, Baron afterwards Count Komura, who had held the portfolio of foreign affairs throughout the war, and Mr. afterwards Baron Takahira. In entering this conference, Japanese statesmen, as was subsequently known, saw clearly that a great part of the credit accruing to them for their successful conduct of the war would be forfeit in the sequel of the negotiations. For the period of Japan had accustomed themselves to expect that Russia would assuredly recoup the expenses incurred by their country in the contest, whereas the cabinet in Tokyo understood well to look for payment for indemnity by a great state whose territory had not been invaded effectively, nor its existence menaced, must be futile. Nevertheless, diplomacy required that this conviction should be concealed, and thus Russia carried to the conference a belief that the financial phase of the discussion would be crucial, while at the same time the Japanese nation reckoned fully on an indemnity of 150 millions sterling. Baron Komura's mandate was, however, that the only radically essential terms were those formulated by Japan prior to the war. She must insist on securing the ends for which she fought, since she believed them to be indispensable to the peace of the Far East. But she would not demand anything more. The Japanese plenipotentiary, therefore, judged it wise to marshal his terms in the order of their importance, leaving his Russian colleague to imagine, as he probably would, that the converse method had been adopted, and that everything preliminary to the questions of finance and territory was of minor consequence. The negotiations commenced on the 10th of August, were not concluded until the 5th of September, when a treaty of peace was signed. There had been a moment when the onlooking world believed that unless Russia agreed to ransom the island of Sakhalin by paying to Japan a sum of 120 millions sterling, the conference would be broken off. Nor did such an exchange seem unreasonable. For were Russia expelled from the north part of Sakhalin, which commands the estuary of the Amur River, her position in Siberia would have been compromised. But the statesmen who directed Japan's affairs were not disposed to make any display of earth hunger. The southern half of Sakhalin had originally belonged to Japan and had passed into Russia's possession by an agreement which the Japanese nation strongly resented. To recover that position of the island seemed, therefore, a legitimate ambition. Japan did not contemplate any larger demand, nor did she seriously insist on an indemnity. Therefore, the negotiations were never in real danger of failure. The Treaty of Portsmouth recognized Japan's paramount political, military, and economic interests in Korea, provided for the simultaneous evacuation of Manchuria by the contracting parties, transferred to Japan the lease of Liaotung Peninsula held by Russia from China together with the Russian railways south of Kwangchen Sea and all collateral mining of other privileges, ceded to Japan the southern half of Sakhalin, the 50th parallel of latitude, also to be the boundary between the two parts, securing fishing rights for Japanese subjects along the coast of the seas of Japan. Okhotsk and Bering laid down that the expenses incurred by the Japanese for the maintenance of the Russian prisoners during the war should be reimbursed by Russia, lest the outlays made by the latter on account of Japanese prisoners, by which arrangement Japan obtained a payment of some 4 millions sterling, and provided that the contracting parties, while withdrawing their military forces from Manchuria, might maintain guards to protect their respective railways. The number of such guards not to exceed 15 per kilometre of line. There were other important restrictions. First, the contracting parties were to abstain from taking, on the Russo-Korean frontier, any military measures which might menace the security of Russia or Korean territory. Secondly, the two powers pledged themselves not to exploit the Manchurian railways for strategic purposes. And thirdly, they promised not to build on Sakhalin or its adjacent islands any fortifications or other similar military works, or to take military measures which might impede the free navigation of the Straits of La Pérouse and the Gulf of Tartary. The above provisions concerned the two contracting parties only, but China's interests were also considered. Thus, it was agreed to restore entirely and completely to her exclusive administration all portions of Manchuria then in the occupation or under the control of Japanese or Russian troops, except the leased territory, that her consent to be obtained for the transfer to Japan of the leases and concessions held by the Russians in Manchuria, that the Russian government would disavow the possession of any territorial advantages or preferential or exclusive concessions in impairment of Chinese sovereignty or inconsistent with the principle of equal opportunity in Manchuria, and that Japan and Russia engaged reciprocally not to obstruct any general measures common to all countries which China might take for the development of the commerce and industry of Manchuria. This distinction between the special interests of the contracting parties and the interests of China herself, as well as of foreign nations, generally is essential to clear understanding of a situation which subsequently attracted much attention. From the time of the Opium War, 1857, to the Boxer Rising, 1900, each of the great Western powers struggled for its own hand in China, and each sought to gain for itself exclusive concessions and privileges with comparatively little regard for the interests of the others, and with no regard whatever for China's sovereign rights. The fruits of this period were permanently ceded territories, brackets Hong Kong and Macau, close brackets, leases temporarily establishing foreign sovereignty in various districts, bracket Kiao Chao, Wei Hai Wei and Quang Chao, close brackets, railway and mining concessions, and the establishment of settlements at open ports where foreign jurisdiction was supreme. But when, in 1900, the Boxer Rising forced all of the powers into a common camp, they awoke to full appreciation of a principle which has been growing current for the past 2 or 3 years, namely, that concerted action of the lines of maintaining China's integrity and securing to all alike equally of opportunity and a similarly open door was the only feasible method of preventing the partition of the Chinese Empire and averting a clash of rival interests which might have disastrous results. This, of course, did not mean that there was to be any abandonment of special privileges already required or any surrender of existing concessions. The arrangement was not to be retrospective in any sense. Vested interests were to be strictly guarded until the lapse of the periods for which they had been granted, or until the maturity of China's competence to be really autonomous. A curious situation was thus created. Internationally, professions of respect for China's sovereignty, for the integrity of her empire, and for the enforcement of the open door and equal opportunity coexisted with legacies from an entirely different past. Russia endorsed this new policy, but not a naturally declined to abate any of the advantages previously enjoyed by her in Manchuria. Those advantages were very substantial. They included a 25 years lease with provisions for renewal of the Liaotung Peninsula, within which area of 1,220 square miles Chinese troops might not penetrate, whereas Russia would not only exercise full administrative authority, but also take military and naval action of any kind. They included the creation of a neutral territory in the intermediate north of the former and still more extensive, which should remain under Chinese administration, but where neither Chinese nor Russian troops might enter, nor might China, without Russia's consent, cede land, open trading marts, or grant concessions to any third nationality. And they included the right to build some 1,600 miles of railway, which China would have the opportunity of purchasing at cost price in the year 1938 and would be entitled to receive gratis in 1982, close bracket, as well as the right to hold extensive zones on either side of the railway to administer these zones in the fullest sense, and to work all mines laying along the zones and to work all mines laying along the lines. Under the Portsmouth Treaty, these advantages were transferred to Japan by Russia, the railway, however, being divided so that only the portion bracket 5,200 bracket 521.5 miles to the south of Kwang Chengzi fell to Japan's share, whilst the portion bracket 1,077 mile close bracket to the north of that place remained in Russia's hands. China's consent to the above transfers and assignments was obtained in a treaty signed at Peking on the 22nd of December 1905. Thus Japan came to hold in Manchuria a position somewhat contradictory. On the one hand, she figured as the champion of the Chinese empire's integrity and as an exponent of the new principle of equal opportunity and the open door. On the other, she appeared as the legatee of many privileges, more or less inconsistent with that principle. But, at the same time, nearly all the great powers of Europe were similarly circumstanced. In their case, also the same incongruity was observable between the newly professed policy and the aftermath of the old practice. It was scarcely to be expected that Japan alone should make a large sacrifice on the altar of a territory. No, Japan alone should make a large sacrifice on the altar of a theory to which no other state thought of yielding any retrospective obedience whatever. She did indeed furnish a clear proof of deference to the open door doctrine, for instead of reserving the railway zone to her own exclusive use, as she was fully entitled to do, she sought and obtained from China a pledge to open to foreign trade 16 places within these zones. For the rest, however, the inconsistency between the past and the present, though existing throughout the whole of China, was nowhere so conspicuous as in the three eastern provinces, Manchuria, not because there was any real difference of degree, but because Manchuria had been the scene of the greatest war of modern times. Because that war had been fought by Japan in the cause of the new policy, and because of the principles of equally open door and of China's integrity, had been the main basis of the Portsmouth Treaty, of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, and of the subsequently concluded ententes with France and Russia. In short, the world's eyes were fixed on Manchuria and diverted from China proper, so that every act of Japan was subjected to an exceptionally rigorous scrutiny, and the nations behaved as though they expected her to live up to a standard of almost ideal altitude. China's mood, too, greatly complicated the situation. She had the choice between two moderate and neutral courses, either to wait quietly until the various concessions granted by her to foreign powers in the evil past should lapse by maturity, or to qualify herself by earnest reforms and industrious development for their earlier recovery. Nominally, she adopted the latter course, but in reality, she fell into a mood of much impatience. Under the name of Rights Recovery Campaign, her people began to protest vehemently against the continuance of any condition which impaired her sovereignty, and as this temper coloured her attitude towards various questions which inevitably grew out of the situation in Manchuria, her relations with Japan became somewhat strained in the early part of 1909.